Afternoon, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the International Conference on Islam and Human Rights on the parallel session on Islam, Human Rights, and Public Policy. I am Mimin Dwi Hartono, will be a moderator for this session. While we are waiting for the resource person, we will begin this session. This session will invited three resource person. The first is Professor Nur Hadi Hasan. He is the Dean of Islamic Studies of the Universitas Islam Internasional Indonesia. Good afternoon, Professor Nur Hadi. Hello, Professor. Are you with us? Assalamualaikum, Professor Nur Hadi Hasan. Okay, we're waiting for the connection with Professor Nur Hadi. And the second speaker will be Professor Masud Badrin. He is Professor of Law in SOAS University of London, School of Oriental Studies Africa, University of London. And the third speaker is Professor Siti Ruhaini Yuhayati. She was the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Currently, she is expert staff in the Presidential Staff Office in Jakarta. So we will have three distinguished speakers.
Mungkin jarang bisa.
The three speakers are really experienced and have many ideas and also knowledge that they will going share to us within this session. Okay, so I will try to communicate with Professor Nur Hadi. Assalamualaikum, Professor Nur Hadi.
Yes, Waalaikumsalam. Selamat siang. Good afternoon, everyone.
Yes, how are you, Professor?
Very good, very good. I couldn't, mute my microphone before.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Welcome, Professor Siti Ruhaini. Assalamualaikum, Professor. Yeah, yeah. I'm very glad to be a moderator in this session. I am sure will be very interesting because all panelists are professor and will bring its perspective on how Islam, human rights, and public policy in pertaining with the contribution of Islam toward the tolerance and also human dignity. So first, I will briefly explain about the background and also the biography of the three panelists. The first is Professor Dr. Siti Ruhaini Yuhayatin. As I mentioned before, she is currently the expert staff in the Office of Presidential Staff in Jakarta. She was the chairperson of the Islamic Human Rights Commission within the Islamic Organization of Cooperation. And the second is Professor Masud Badrin. He hold a diploma in Arabic and Islamic Studies with distinction from the University of Maiduguri, Nigeria. He has been Professor of Laws in the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS, University of London since 2007. He was also appointed by the UN Human Rights Council as the UN independent expert on the situation of human rights in Sudan from 2012 to 2014. He is a fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. And the last speaker is Professor Nur Haidi Hasan. He is a professor of Islam and Politics and Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University. He is also lecturer in the Islamic International University in Depok City, West Java. He got PhD from Utrecht University in 2005 and Master of Philosophy from the International Institute for the Study of Islam in the Modern World in 2000 and Master of Art from the Leiden University in 1999. Without further delay, I will begin this discussion. This discussion will emphasize on how Islam and human rights have an inherent spirit in encouraging human public policies that provide benefit for mankind, which are fair and take set also with the marginal and minority group. So in the context of the discussion will be how the public policy and also public service ensure that everyone, regardless their religion and also belief, has the right to get public service which are fair, equal, and non-discriminatory. Okay, I will start with Professor Nur Haidi Hasan. Please, you have around 20 minutes to start, Professor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, Bapak Mimin Haryanto. I would like to share my screen. My screenshot, please, okay. We can share on this, okay. Yeah, here it is. Yes, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to join this very prestigious conference. This is a big honor for me. I'm very happy because I will talk in this panel together with my colleague, Professor Rohaini Johayatin, and distinguished Professor Masud Badrin. Yes. One of the biggest challenge for us in Muslim country, including Indonesia, to disseminate human rights and translate it into public policy is widespread misperception and misunderstanding of the concept. Human rights is still misunderstood by Muslims, the majority of Muslims in fact, as a Western notion deliberately instilled into their minds to make them powerless and remain under the Western hegemony. This is even more so in the context of Indonesia today, when we are witnessing the rise of conservatism and Islamic radicalism, marked by the emergence of various hardline Muslim groups that call for the Sharia, Khilafah, and also perpetrate some violent acts in the Indonesian public sphere. In order for us to give our society better understanding about the relationship between Islam and human rights, there is no option for us but to try to disseminate this concept better and also try to explain the relationship between Islam and human rights. This is very important because this will somehow probably reduce the misunderstanding and the misperception of Muslims about the human rights. Human rights is actually a universal concept born out of the endeavors made by people from all civilizations, including Islamic civilization, to demand the restoration of their basic rights and dignity as human beings. We still understand well during the medieval era, when the patrimonial political system dominated the world, people could not enjoy their basic rights and dignity as human beings. They were under the oppression and suppression by the regimes in power. But after the Enlightenment, we began to realize that we need to restore our basic rights and we need to live really as human beings. This is a long struggle actually, involving all people from all civilization in the world. There are many approach scholars try to implement in order to reduce the misperception and misunderstanding of Muslims about the human rights. There is sort of a psychological, philosophical approach, a hermeneutical approach that try to explain let's say, the compatibility between Islam and human rights. There is also a historical approach, but the most significant one is actually scholars that try to use the perspective in Maqasid Sharia to understand the compatibility between Islam and human rights. Based on this perspective, it is believed that the fundamental values of Islam, as reflected in the concept of Maqasid Sharia, Maqasid Sharia is the ultimate goal of the Sharia, are coherent with human rights principles, which respect life, progeny, intellectuality, property, and religious diversity. We also understand from the historical trajectory of Islam that human rights is actually the main principle guiding the Prophet Muhammad to establish Islamic civilization in Medina. At the time, based on the Piagam Madinah or Madinah Charter, Muslims live side by side with Christians and also Jews. They could collaborate each other to establish the so-called the Medinan civilization, which is, to my opinion, is actually the main characters and the intrinsic character of Islam. From the Islamic perspective, life is something highly respected and unremovable for any reason. So there is no reason, there is no justification in any sense to remove life of someone. We cannot kill somebody, or there is no reason to kill somebody. Life should be protected and respected. This is very basic in Islam, and we believe in that. This is exactly the same with human rights. Human rights also respect very much the life. It is the very foundational nature of human life to protect life. Automatically, all fundamental things to support the life should be guaranteed and protected. Life cannot be protected if there is no sufficient jobs for the people, if there is no security for the people, if there is no sufficient education for the people, and so on and so forth. So all fundamental things related to life, the protection of life should also be guaranteed and protected. Maqasid Sharia in this context constitute the common ground that brings together Islam and human rights. To my opinion, commitment to protect human rights means commitment to achieve the Maqasid Sharia. So from now on, actually, we should no longer, like juxtapose Islam and human rights. Because we understand that when we apply human rights, automatically we apply the Maqasid Sharia. We implement the Sharia, of course, in the substantial sense, yes, in our life. Looking closely into the discussion among the Muslim ulama, among the scholars about the Maqasid Sharia, we will encounter some very enlightful discussions that explain that Maqasid Sharia originally develops from the concept of maslahah, identical to God's purpose in revealing His law to humankind, which is generally aims at achieving public good, well-being of humanity, and justice for all. Sharia, when understood well, actually is no other than the human right itself. I mean, yeah, the purpose of the Sharia is exactly the same with the purpose of the human right. It is to achieve public good, well-being of humanity, and justice for all. Masalah is the main procedural vehicle to address legal change and can be used as a tool to find new law when authoritative texts are silent and of adapting existing law when circumstances call for it. This is usul fiqh discussion, and we from the usul fiqh, from the classical ulama, we already know that there is a big opportunity for Muslims to develop our understanding about something new, including new framework of our life. And maslahah can be used as a procedural vehicle tool to respond such a change. So there is no taboo for Muslim actually to conduct ijtihad and to introduce new understanding of something or new laws and new norms to our life. In the Islamic tradition, legal change is brought about by change in the interpretation and derivation of law in accordance with existing ratio legis or ilah. Al-hukmu yaduru ma'al illatihi wujudan wa adaman. So what is very basic in Islamic law is actually the ratio legis. Yeah, ratio legis can be understood through the reason, through the customs, through the common practices, and that will inform us what legal norm that can be followed by Muslims. Some Greek scholars like Ash-Shatibi, At-Tufi, and Jurjani already inform us about certain aspect of the maslah and maqasid sharia that might be interesting to be taken into account. Like, for instance, Ash-Shatibi related maslah with fundamental protections, as I mentioned before: life, intellectuality, al-aqal, progeny, and nasal, property, al-mal, and religious diversity, ad-din, with priority scale, with daruri, haji, and tahsini. You should consider that daruri life is always daruri. We should protect lives. And then haji related to something probably in intellectuality. We need to develop our intellectuality, education, research, and so on. But of course, this come after the daruriya thing, like life. Yeah? And then tahsini, the tertiary thing, the third thing, yes, come after the daruriya and the haji. And according to At-Tufi, maslah is the main indicand, the main dalil. Yeah, indicand is dalil to know what God wills, especially related to muamalah, transaction, and mundane issues. So, if we find a dalil in the Quran to say something, and this dalil should not be understood simply by referring to the literal text of the dalil, but we have to see the maslahah behind the dalil, because the maslahah is the main indicand according to At-Tufi. And At-Tufi is convinced that the logic and wisdom allow us to know the maslahah in all aspects of our life except the ibadah. Yeah, in ibadah we don't have any space to discuss, because this come from God and we just follow it according to At-Tufi. But concerning other aspects of our life, muamalah, then civil activities and economic activities, we can maximize the use of our logic and wisdom to understand the God wills in this context. And al-adah muhakamah, according to Al-Jawzani, is actually something continuously practiced and accepted by common logic. And this is a legal norms applicable in a society, al-adat muhakkamah. So if there is something continuously practiced and accepted by common logic, by people, by the society, it is actually a legal norm for that society. This is very strong statement by Al-Jurjani to allow us to conduct ijtihad and also to develop our legal framework, our Islamic legal understanding about the religion. This is one particular example from the At-Tufi. If there is a legal indicand or dalil, if dalil is coherent with the maslahah or agree with the masalah, and then you should go on, you apply the dalil, and at the same time you apply the maslahah. If the dalil disagree with the maslahah, what you should do. You should reconcile between dalil and the maslahah. If reconciliation is possible, and then you can go on to apply the dalil and the maslahah at the same time. But if you cannot achieve the reconciliation, you should try to dig up more the maslahah, the maslahah aspect of the dalil. And if maslahah allow you to apply the dalil, you can go ahead. So this is like a scheme applied by Tufi to indicate that maslahah is very important, much more important than the dalil itself. Yasir Auda, contemporary scholars from Egypt, which is now based in Qatar, my close friend as well, try to reformulate and interpret Maqasid Sharia in a couple of books he published. And his opinion is very interesting, actually. According to Yasir Auda, whether or not the Maqasid Sharia is achieved well in the society is no longer to be seen from visibility of Islamic symbols. It is not important for a nation or for a society to apply the Islamic banking or whatever, yes, the so-called Islamic symbol. If they cannot achieve the so-called HDI ranking better, they can improve the HDI ranking. Yeah, I mean the Maqasid Sharia can be recognized through HDI ranking. It is very interesting, if we see HDI as a tool developed by the UN to measure and rank countries' level of social, economic development, including life expectancy, main years of schooling, income per capita, and religious freedom, you will find that the countries like Sweden, Finland, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Denmark, UK, France, and so always are on the top of the ranking. And Muslim countries are the best one is number 31, if I'm not mistaken, yes, in the HDI ranking. Auda argued that Maqasid Sharia can be achieved in a country which is non-Islamic in a traditional sense, so long as justice, religious freedom, gender equality, and human rights are respected. This is the HDI ranking and human rights scores related actually each other. If a country can achieve good ranking in Human Development Index, they can also achieve good scores in Human Rights Index. Like here, United Arab Emirates, this is number 35, Saudi Arabia 36, Brunei 43, and so on, Indonesia 110 probably, and then Muslim countries from the human rights scores generally belongs to the categories of authoritarian regime, 0 till 4, hybrid regime, and flow democracy. Indonesia belongs to flow democracy, yes, based on the human rights score. So we are still a bit, regretful, yes, of these realities. The Muslim countries, including our country, cannot still, yes, position itself in the highest ranking, either HDI or human rights scores. So now, after trying to, let's say, reconcile the human rights and Islam, we also try to understand that actually human rights is actually the very basic fundamentals in our nation state. So I mean, if we talk about nation state, Indonesia as Negara Kesatuan Indonesia, Negara Kesatuan Republik Indonesia, Indonesia as a modern nation state, actually this is directly bring us to the notion of citizenship and human right. Citizenship and human right are the very basic notion behind the modern nation states. Because nation states is built on the principle of citizenship. And citizenship is exactly representing the willingness of human being to respect the human right and to position human being on the highest position as human being. Citizenship assures that every citizen has the same right and duty before the state, regardless of his or her religion, ethnicity, race, gender, and other primordial identity. So we understand from our legal system as well, yes, there is a freedom of religion because citizenship assures that every citizen has the same right and duty before the state. We cannot, distinguish people because of the difference of their religion. we need to deliver the same rights for Christians, Jews, for Christians or for Hindus and Buddhists to practice their religion, like we Muslims can also practice our religion. Tolerance, openness, civic sharing, inclusivity, reciprocity, pluralism, multiculturalism, democracy, and respect for human rights are the very basic of human rights. So actually, human rights should be understood as the very fundamental principles of our country. It is quite clear that human rights is very legitimate in our national legal system. The Indonesian Constitution has 5 articles upholding human rights. Is 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 34, which regulate the basic right of Indonesian citizens, right to life, education, freedom of expression, equality before the law, religious freedom, and right to get a job. Law number 39, 1999, clearly strengthens the position of human rights as the main reference in our national life. So we can no longer abandon the importance of human life for our practice in the context of nation state. Indonesia has also ratified all international covenants, including Universal Declaration of Human Rights, ICCPR, CICIHR, Covenant on the Elimination of form of discrimination against women, and ICCPR, for instance, and integrated them into the national legal system. Indonesia is recorded as one of the most progressive countries in ratifying and accepting international covenant. But of course, the attempts to translate human rights convention is not always easy. Yeah, like in Indonesia or elsewhere, the translation process of human rights into national regulation involve kind of tension and negotiation involving different people, different communities and stakeholders of the country. But in a way, we are very happy in this country, Indonesia, especially because we can see already the implementation of the law on human rights, and also several regulations supported the application of the law. Public policy in the framework of human rights, because human rights principles are inherent in Islam and also inherent in the context of nation state. That is why human rights principles should be translated into public policies. The main characteristic of human rights-based public policies are their basic orientation to empower people, to respect people, and to position people at their fundamental position as human beings, so that they can claim their dignity as human beings. The state assures that all public policies it introduces are only for the maslahah of the people. This is not the maslahah for the other or for certain group in the society, but for the maslahah of the people. So if a public policy is implemented on the basis of human rights, actually we will see no longer any sphere, poverty, for instance, stunting, and other things related to our neglect of applying the principle of human rights. In realizing the maslahah, the state should be committed to materializing citizenship principles, democracy, human rights, pluralism, multiculturalism, and justice. And also, as the consequence of increased diversity within and between religious groups, it is more difficult for societies to manage pluralism and multiculturalism. This is indeed the time for us to reflect our position about pluralism and multiculturalism, because the changing situation, global situation, national situation, put us in more difficult situation to manage pluralism and multiculturalism. Some groups refuse to recognize the pre-existence of other groups, and also develop the so-called identity politics based on their own exclusivist doctrinal position or ethnicity, because they are competing each other to get access into economy, into politics, and so on. That's why this somehow, result in insecurity and also threatens our unity as a nation fellow. Herein lies the importance of multiculturalism as a principle to protect religious and cultural diversity, civic mindedness and human rights. Yes, religious moderation might be used to tackle the problem of rising intolerance and conservatism among Indonesians, but it should be under the framework of human rights as well. We have to develop our religious moderation program, and we are very happy the government supported this program, put it as a national strategic program, and that is very good. But we have to understand as well, religious moderation program should be in line with the human rights principles. Yes, not many Indonesians have an open stand toward minority religious groups still. They have been coached by lazy tolerance, and they only accept people from different religious groups with certain conditions. This is based on our research a couple of years ago. So yes, we have Pancasila, we have Undang-Undang Dasar 45, yes, the Constitution, but still, intolerance is undershadowing the nation. And the program can be strengthened by combining it with the campaigns for human rights and religious diversity. This is a small example of our collaboration with the Norwegian Center of Human Rights. Since 2013, the program has operated and aimed at improving the awareness of KUA. KUA is the Office of Religious Affairs at the sub-district level. Why KUA? Because we consider KUA, people at the KUA as the main religious actors at the forefront to communicate the notion of human rights to people at the grassroots. So far as I know, human rights is discussed widely and intensively, but only involve those from the educated background, like what we are doing today. We are in the hotel discussing about the human right, but people at the grassroots do not know what human right is. So probably we need also to think about how to deliver this program into the grassroots level. And we try this program involving the KUA people at the grassroots to introduce religious diversity and human rights. And we apply also the so-called Maqasidus Syariah-based facts as framework to develop this program. And to my opinion, this has been quite successful. KUA people that have been involved in this program, they become aware of the human rights principle and also the sensitivities around the religious diversity and human rights. I mean, this kind of program at the small scale might be developed by Komnas HAM, for instance, or the government agencies. This is one example of our latest publication, Membela Hak Masyarakat Rentan, Defending the Vulnerable Societies, talking about human rights, religious diversity, and family issues. Yes, the content of the book, this is one of the examples as well. We are dealing with the minority religious group who are difficult to get akta nikah, their marriage certificates, because they are Ahmadiyya, because they are Shia, for instance. This is only examples of how human rights is implemented at the grassroots level through some interventive activities. And this is, I think, all what I want to say. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And yes, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Give applause to Professor Nur Hadi Hasan. Thank you, Professor. It's very nice presentation, and also many things that you have presented are really, for me, is enlightening. And I don't want to resume your presentation, but I would like to just to emphasize several of points. The first is that actually that human rights are compatible with Islamic values and also norm. For example, is the Magazid al-Sharia that respecting and also protecting the right to life, right to progress, and right to have property, and right to freedom of thought or intellectuality, which is in terms of human rights belong to the non-derogable rights. And Professor Nur Hadi also gave some example that how public policy are really implemented in grassroots level, that in terms of human rights and also Islamic values, that public policy shall empower people in order to can claim the right. The second is the religious moderation, which is also a kind of public policy to provide dialogue among the religious and also believer. And the third is the project with the KUA people, which is in the forefront, how that Islamic values are really delivering to those who belong to the marginalized group. This is very interesting. Thank you. I would like to have the book and I will read it, Professor. I think that's really human right book.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Second, I will invite Professor Masud Badrin. He is already with us in the Zoom. Assalamualaikum, Professor Masud.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clear. Thank you, Professor. Good morning in London, I think. It's really
Thank you very much
early
for
morning.
having me. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for joining us, Professor. And we are here really would like to listen what you are going to present it. And please, you can begin your presentation, Professor.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be part of this conference, even though virtually. And I'm really pleased to be on the platform with Professor Noor Heidi Hassan. I mean, I've heard his presentation, and I could actually say that, well, he has said everything that I wanted to say, but I mean, I'll just go through my notes, and then perhaps maybe if I repeat whatever he has said before, it is just a confirmation of what we all believe to be the case in relationship with Islam and human rights. I'm also very pleased to be sharing with, Professor Siti Rohani. I will be here to listen to his, presentation as well. Now, I have titled my presentation as Human Rights-Based Approach to Public Policy, an Islamic Perspective. That is human rights-based approach to public policy, an Islamic perspective. Now, the first point I want to look at is, when we say public policy, what do we mean by public policy? And I have indicated, public policy generally consists of a set of actions, that is plans, conducts, and laws, consciously adopted by a government, or better, by a state. Public policy has to be a conscious, decision of a state or a government to ensure good governance and the well-being of its general populace, and also to enhance not only its national interest, but also its international credibility. So this is why public policy is very, very important. It must be formulated consciously, because it is not about a state thinking only about its internal national interest, but usually also in relation to its international credibility. Now, for that reason, you find out that human rights has become a very important catalyst for public policy. Because today, human rights has become, as I said, an indispensable catalyst for scrutinizing the public policy of states globally. And there's no state in the world today that can be indifferent to the challenges of human rights, particularly in formulating their public policy. Therefore, you find out that most states, including Muslim majority states, endeavor to ensure that their public policy and practices are human rights compliant, to ensure internal stability and international credibility. So public policy today is very, very important. Now, if you look in the literature, the best public policies today are inclusive public policies. The best public policies are categorized to be inclusive public policies. And this depends, on the level of good governance of a particular country. Now, if we look in the literature, the historical evolution of power, usually is classified into three levels. That, power has evolved from anarchy to the centralized state. Then it has to move from the centralized state to the inclusive state. Those are the levels. Until a nation reaches the level of inclusive state, it may not be able to adopt an inclusive public policy. Now, when we look at anarchy, I mean, the systems of power of anarchy, an anarchical state listens only to itself. It doesn't really, bother about what the populace says. Most states have moved away from anarchy. Most states are centralized states. Centralized state has the tendency of looking only inwards, listening only to its own constituents, without much consideration for the views of its outer, populace in its formulation of public policy. But when a state reaches an inclusive state, it looks both inwards to its own internal constituencies and also outwards to its populace, and it considers the views of the populace in its formulation of an inclusive public policy. Now, inclusive public policies are best achieved through a human rights-based approach, because then you need to think about the concerns of the people. Now, having now discussed briefly my perception of human rights, my perception of public policy in a human rights-based approach, I want to look at the Islamic perspective to this. Whether can Islamic law, Islam satisfy this notion of an inclusive public policy that is human rights compliant and also reflects the views of its populace. Now, many of the points I want to make are based on my book on international human rights and Islamic law. And in it, I identify, in many of my writings, I identify that, when we look at the relationship between Islam and human rights, you find out that the debates might be divided into three categories. There are those who see Islam in relation to human rights from an adversarial perspective, that, they cannot be bedfellows. They cannot be compatible. That is, they look at it from adversarial perspective. Then there are those who look at it from an harmonistic perspective, as for example, Professor Noor Haidi has mentioned in his presentation that human rights and Islam and Islamic law can be compatible in that perspective, and this is what my work also reflects. But more than that, a lot of the time in relation to practice, human rights and Islamic law relationship is like a double-edged thing. It depends, and this is where the state or the authority, governance comes into the picture. Even though some say it is adversarial, some say it is harmonistic, in practice, it is double-edged. It depends on the rulership. The rulership can make it either adversarial or they can make it harmonistic based on their interpretations of the norms. So it is double-edged, really. Now, my perspective is that in Islamic political legal theory, governance is instituted to ensure human well-being. They call it jalbul masalih. This is what governance is for, to promote human well-being and avoid mischief, affliction, or suffering. And you find this in, classical Islamic jurisprudential books. You read it all the time. Jalbul masalih wa dar'il mafasid. That is, promotion of human well-being and avoidance of human suffering. That is what the state is for in Islam. That is what governance is all for. And if you see, this is very well represented in the statement accredited to the third caliph, Uthman bin Affan, in which he is reported to have said that, Inna Allah la yazza'u bil sultan ma la yazza'u bil Quran. That is actually, God, fulfills, he upholds goodness on earth through the ruling authority, what is not upheld by the Quran. So the ruling authority plays a very, very important role. And we see this all the time. A lot of the time, Muslims want to point to the theoretical provisions of the Quran, that the Quran says this, and if there's no authority that wants to implement it, the Quran cannot implement itself. Sayyidina Ali himself said that, indicating that, and to emphasize the situation that when we talk about public policy, human rights, and Islamic law, the authority, governing authority, plays a very important role in it. As Sayyidina Usman said, Inna Allah la yazza bil sultan ma la yazza bil Quran. Allah fulfills, God fulfills goodness on earth with the ruling authority, what he has not fulfilled through the Quran. So this is where it is important in relation to public policy consciously formulated by a state, particularly a Muslim majority state. And the framework, the legal and theoretical, the political, legal and theoretical framework, Islamic political and legal framework for public policy. It relates to exactly what Professor Nur Haidi has said. It's usually based on siyasa sharia, and maqasid sharia. Siyasa actually, siyasa, if you interpret it, properly, it means policy. So siyasa is about public policy. Now, and siyasa in Arabic comes, the root is sasa, yasusu. It can be rotten. Sasa yasusu means something that is rotten. That is, something that is so siyasa policy can be rotten. Political policy can be a rot unless it is presented in the framework of the Sharia. And this is why the concept of siyasa sharia. Even though siyasa is tricky, it's rotten, if you put it in the framework of the Sharia, then goodness can come out of it. And this is why the framework of siyasa, public policy in Islam is based on the on the public on siyasa sharia, which has been mentioned earlier. The scholars, Shatibi, Tufi, and all of them identify that the basis of it is protection of life, protection of religion, protection of family, property, and intellect. And the gate is not closed. Some scholars have added a sixth, protection of honor. Scholars like Hashim Kamali and others, and they argue, even Qardawi indicates that this door is not closed. From time to time, we can add to it, as long as it is for promoting, it's for jalb masalih, it is for promoting goodness. So when I talk about inclusive public policy, actually Islam promotes it. Islam recognizes inclusive public policy. It's reflected in the Quran. The Quran tells us in 2 verses, وَالَّذِينَ اسْتَجَابُوا لِرَبِّهِمْ وَأَقَامُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُم وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُم. It says the believers, in an Islamic state, in a Muslim state, it says those who are the real believers are those, who answer their Lord, uphold the prayer, and their affairs is in consultation. There's consultation amongst themselves. So, public policy in Islam based on this must reflect, consultation. It must be inclusive. It must not only look inwards into people who are in government, but it must be in consultation with the people. Now, you find out that, even the Prophet himself, if you look in the Quran, in Surah Al-Imran, the Prophet, the Quran says, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَزًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَمْ فَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. So even the Prophet, even though he receives revelation, still he was instructed by God that, it is because that it is due to the mercy of your God that you deal with them gently. If you are too high-handed, they will have dispersed away from you. And the Quran, God commanded him, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, consult them in their affairs. So this shows about the importance of inclusive public policy. The state has to take consideration of what the people's view are. Now, the human rights-based approach in Islam, the concept of human rights is very well established. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, as has been said earlier, and surely we dignified and honored the progenies of Adam. So from an Islamic perspective, human rights is inherent in human beings. And it's very, very important. Generally, any Muslim majority country does not have an excuse if its public policy is not human rights oriented. It's not human rights compliant, because of the fact that human rights is very, very essential, and Islam recognizes it. Now, I just want to round up, because I've just prepared for 15-20 minutes, so that perhaps maybe there will be possible discussion. I don't want to repeat too much everything that the first speakers already mentioned, which I already have on my notes, but I don't want to be repetitive. I just want to go to three selected specific public policy areas of importance, which I think is very, very important in relation to particularly, Islam and human rights in Muslim majority countries. I mean, and this conference is in Indonesia, which is the most populated Muslim country in the world. It's very, very important that, I mean, if, for example, we just want to select a few, I've selected just these 3 specific policy areas, which I believe it is important for any country, for any state today to consider in relation to public policy and human rights, particularly Muslim majority countries. The first one, from an Islamic perspective, from both a Western and Islamic perspective, is that public policy must, reflect the concept of constitutionalism and rule of law. It must reflect constitutionalism and rule of law. I mean, it's very, very important that, and people should be informed about this. People should be oriented in the sense that the state should not operate in an ad hoc fire brigade approach, that we just take it as it comes. No, this is why constitutionalism is important, and the public policy must be based on the rule of law. I mean, otherwise, there will be no accountability. And otherwise, it cannot be inclusive enough. And from an Islamic perspective, this is reflected actually from the practice of the Holy Prophet Muhammad himself. Peace and blessings be upon him. A lot of the time when we reflect on the Islamic governance, people go back to the nascent state of Medina. That is the example that we all refer to. Now, if you look at when the Prophet made his hijrah from Mecca to Medina, even before he built his mosque, when he came from Mecca to Medina, the first step that the Prophet did was a step in constitutionalism. We all know, the Wathiqa al-Medina, that is the constitution of Medina. That's the first step. Even though the Quran was being revealed, the Prophet didn't say that, no, we will rely, we don't need any other constitution. We don't need any other document. It is only what Allah tells me that will rule us. No, he didn't do that. The first thing he did, was to, formulate the Wathiqatul Madina, which is considered to be the first constitution of the world. And he indicated that this is what will govern the relationship of all the residents of Medina. So through the charter, the Prophet set a precedent for the recognition of constitutionalism and rule of law, not an ad hoc way. And that's the first important point of, formulating an inclusive, human rights-oriented public policy. Now, if you look, Al-Ghunaymi and many, writings, particularly Al-Ghunaymi, indicates, it reported a situation between the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, when they were in Medina, Caliph Abu Bakr in Medina, that he had a quarrel with a Jew in Medina after the Wathiqat Medina has been formulated by the Prophet. And he was so annoyed, the altercation was so deep. And Abu Bakr said, if not for the Wathiqa, if not for the Charter of Medina, I will have cut off your head. So you find out that, the Wathiqatul Medina provided, some sort of accountability. As Abu Bakr said, if not for that constitution, I will have done something so bad for you. So constitutionalism and rule of law must be reflected for any good public policy, which must be inclusive and human rights oriented. Any Muslim country today does not have any excuse, to say that, well, no, they cannot follow constitutionalism. Although many Muslims say that, well, they are understood, their constitution is the Quran and things like that. But the Quran contains so many things, therefore it's usually very good to have a framework, which is, based on constitutionalism and public and rule of law. The second point I want to talk about is, public policy. The second important point is equality and non-discrimination. I think, this Professor Nur Haidi also did refer to this, particularly in the context of Indonesia. Equality and non-discrimination is very, very important. Now, if we look at the world today, even when there was concentration of particularly maybe religious groups in particular sectors in various countries, even at that time, you find in the practice of the Prophet recognition of equality and non-discrimination. Talk more of today, when you find out that globalization and also migration has created So many pluralistic societies. There's no country today, no even Muslim, even Saudi Arabia, even Indonesia, that can say that we are 100% Muslim. We don't have any minorities amongst us. No. So therefore you find out that, in the world today, the public policy and human rights practices of most countries are actually, gauged by how much minorities are respected, how much non-discrimination exists, how much equality exists. And it's very, very important. A lot of the time, we find out that many Muslim majority countries are not meeting that requirement, particularly in relation to in religious discrimination. And if we look at it, I used to say a lot. If you look at the Quran, which is the legal authority for Muslims, it starts the very first chapter describes God. It says, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. That's Rabbil Alameen, the Lord of all the worlds. Everyone, the Rabbil Alameen. Then the last chapter, it describes God as Rabbul Nas. Kul a'udhu bi Rabbin Nas, the Lord of humanity. It didn't say Rabbul Muslimin. So it means something. If the Quran starts by describing God as the Lord of the whole world and ending it by calling God the God of all humanity, it's important. It tells us something. So we find out that equality and non-discrimination is important as a public policy thing, and there are so many verses of the Quran because of time. The third point I want to talk about is public policy must reflect the need for respect. That is judicial independence and respect for judicial authority and oversight. Because politicians can make mistakes, things can go wrong, and this is where the judicial authority comes in. Look at even the Prophet, what the Quran says to Muslims at the early stage to show the importance of judicial authority. The Quran says, "Fala wa rabbuka la yu'minuna hatta yuhakimuka fima shajara bainahum thumma la yajidu fi anfusihim harajan mimma qadayt." He says, look, the believers, they can never be believers until they bring their cases to you and you give them judgment and they are satisfied with the judgment that you give. So you find out that, judicial authority is very, very important. And that should be the oversight of both governance and its public policy, orientation. You find in many Muslim countries today, we all know some of them. I think Indonesia is also included. Pakistan, for example, is also included. Sometimes, even the Sharia courts, for example, in Pakistan, the federal Sharia court, which is the highest Sharia court, when they look into things and they give a decision, maybe the local ulama, they are not happy about it, they go on rampage. They go on demonstration and they go on rampage. That's not, an Islamic way of looking at things. There's a rule, there's a maxim, a qaida in Islamic jurisprudence says that hukum al-hakim yarfa'u al-khilaf. Islam accommodates difference of opinion, but when the ruling authority, the judge, is a hukum al-hakim, the decision of the ruling authority, yarfa'u al-khilaf, dissipates all difference of opinion. So it goes to show that, good public policy within Islamic law must have some oversight, because things could rupture up, there could be disagreements. And people should be contented when a judge or a court, the highest court of the land, has made a decision, whether we like it, whether we don't like it. Public policy requires that we agree with it. The only thing that can be done is legal scholarship. Academicians can write to contest that judgment, and usually the court will take this into consideration. Look at the UK, for example. When the Supreme Court gives a judgment, within 24 hours, you can find the judgment on their website. When people are not happy with it, you find academics writing about it, challenging it. The people don't go on rampage. That is the law at that point, but they challenge it. And maybe in the future, the judiciary will take that view into consideration. So I thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I hope I've made, a little bit of contribution to this. And I thank you again for having me. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Professor Masud. I really again enlightening us here, and I don't want to was that to repeat what you have been presented, but several are really interested for me. For example, it's about the humanity-based approach on public policy on in Islamic perspective, which is really nice framework. However, maybe we can have further discussion later how about the implementation in Muslim countries. I think this really, and I think this session will be also interesting. Professor Siti, she was the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission, and for the previous session that many research person mentioned about the Islamic declaration on Islam and human rights. I think we have right person here to explain that. I also heard that this declaration are reviewed and last year shall be adopted, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then there is like delay to adopt this declaration. Maybe Professor Siti can have some information about that. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, moderator, Mas Mimin. Good morning, Professor Masud Badrin. You are so famous in Indonesia because of your books. Yeah. So it is officially translated by our Human Rights National Commissions, and it has been widespread to the universities and civil society as well. So welcome to our discussion. And also my dearest colleagues, Professor Nur Haidi Hassan, who is joining us from Jogja, I think. Colleagues in the room and also colleagues in the online. So thank you very much for having me. And I would like to congratulate the organizer, the Indonesian Commissions for Human Rights, and also the Minister of Religious Affairs for having this very pertinent and timely discussions on how to see and how to look at their human rights, Islam, and public policy, which is actually necessary but uneasy matching, as also mentioned earlier by Professor Badrin and also Professor Nur Haidi Hassan. So I will touch upon things that are supposed to be incorporated to both professors. One is actually we have to look at also aside from all the principle from the Islamic principle and also from international human rights, but we have also to analyze the platform of public policy, because it is very important to see how public policy exercise and also manage in what is called public space. And public space is, next please, so I rely on the committee on running my PowerPoint. So I have three questions actually to propose here. One is how public space and public policy emerge in Muslim world. This is the one. And the second is how Islam fits into modern public space and public policy. And the third is how human rights principle ensure public space and public policy accessible for all people. So this is the three main questions underlines my presentation. So we go next to the slides. As also mentioned by Professor Badrin on how society involves in Muslim world. He gave the examples of Madinah state, which has been perceived as the earliest city state and also the constitution. And I would like to draw broadly to the other Muslim worlds, where religion, including Islam, has played significant roles in human history, through which it secured the collective identity within the accepted context. It can be in Indonesia, it can be in Nigeria, it can be in the Middle East. And how religion also strengthens the so-called ethno-religious communality in the past. Yeah. Before we have a modern nation and before we have a modern state, then Islam actually evolved in ethno-religious communalities. And in that way that religions confined in the process of process of identity development, yeah, which is distinctive, exclusive, homogeneous, uniform in the ethnicity and religion. So it's called ethno-religious, yeah, bound with characteristic leadership with absolute truth claims and sentiment. So this is actually the characteristic of the past ethno-religious communality before the concept of nation is adopted widely in the human civilization. Now, in the race of a nation state covering ethno-religious communalities, then transformation is required. Yeah. Transformation of values, yeah, which the communal sentiment has to be transformed into social consensus. Exclusive, homogeneous understanding of form also has to be transformed into inclusive and heterogeneous society. Yeah. So this is all the process that we have to take into account when we are talking about public space and public policy. Because public space as the platform for exercising human rights, exercising public policy is not static. This is dynamic, it evolves along with human civilization. And when it's come to nations building, yeah, the transformations of religious values to the public virtue, so it's required kind of agency. And if we learn from the emergence and the establishments of religious organization, yeah, particularly in the Southeast Asia, yeah, in Indonesia, we have the largest Muslim organization called Nahdlatul Ulama, and also Muhammadiyah and the smaller groups. Those are actually the very strategic agencies in transforming the ethno-religious values, ethno-religious sentiments into what we recognize now as the public virtue and the social values. So the emergence of modern religious organization function as transformative agency for ethno-religious sentiment into civic values underlying modern society. Next, please. Now, within this public space, yeah, actually contestation is going on between state authority and civic autonomy. So if we can relate to what has been highlighted by Professor Badrins on how constitutionalism and also the concept of justice is actually, this is the contestation. Yeah, this is being part of the contestation between the state and, authority and civil autonomy. Yeah, and and the public space that we have now is actually reflecting on who's dominating this public space. So the authoritarian states tend to dominate public space for the sake of stability and power. And of course, this is an idealistic for for exercising human rights in a certain context. And the second is democratic state. Yeah. The public space is managed by civil autonomy, but protected by the state through its policies. So public policies is supposed to be here. So in the democratic context, so public space has to be managed by civil autonomy or managed by civil, autonomously managed by civil. Religion, including Islam, will be vibrantly exist and alive if civic autonomy is respected by the state. Yeah. Because this is actually the roots, this is actually the sources, the references of what is called by Professor Badrin and Professor Nurhaidi Hassan about inclusive, moderate, tolerant, egalitarians to all religious expression and choices. So this is actually the challenge of the Muslim world in maintaining public space to be civil autonomy, because in so many cases we witness in the Muslim world that this issue is now is being the biggest challenge. Yeah, and as also mentioned by moderator that I was in their OIC Human Rights Commission, and the biggest challenge is to ensure and also to encourage the state in the Muslim world to give wider, roles to civil autonomy to manage public space. And also in this context that religion will be in the authoritarian state, religion will be easily manipulated and politicized if public space is controlled by the state for power. Yeah. It's become fragmented, exclusive, and chauvinistic to a certain person only. So it is why we are blessed in Indonesia that our founding parents of this nation was not choose any one religion to become the official. We have many official and respected local beliefs, and it's become and it's give more civil autonomy to manage their own practices on religion. Yeah. So next, please. So when we are talking about religion, public space, and civil autonomy, then we can take the example of Indonesia. Of course, I'm talking about Indonesia because I'm more familiar with this, where religious life is largely controlled by society in a civil domain, where the state only manages for the administrations like family matters, education, Hajj, religious holidays, and other related issues. Yeah. And religious freedom is socially accepted. Yeah. So Professor Badrin, we also want to say in Indonesia that religious conversion is still perceived as individual matter. And we are trying so hard amidst the, the surfacing of the populism in Indonesia, which who tends to put such a kind of practices to become a public offense. But we are here in Indonesia, the civil society, the Human Rights Commission, and also the governments. The current government is trying to make religious freedom is observed as wide as possible. So this is neither social sanction or state offense for the religious conversion in Indonesia. Moreover, religious tension and conflict, of course, still emerge, but because religious traditions is actually the civil we put it in the civil autonomy, so we mostly perceive this tension as horizontal, and in this way that relatively this tension is manageable through non-judicial or non-legislative approach. So mediation and reconciliations are mostly taken up by civil society organization. So that is actually also the things that we would like to maintain in Indonesia, that the state have minimum intervention when it's come to religious tension. And also from the Indonesian case, we also blessed that religious-based organizations remain independent from the states, and which prevent them being politicized. So the biggest Muslim organization, the two biggest organizations, is the footing, and the strong footings for maintaining the public space, remain civic autonomy. State leaders have no preference to certain religious tradition being the official religion, and stand neutral but protective to all religions. Next, please. Now I will turn to a very specific issue that needs our attention. That is public policy and freedom of religion. So civil autonomy will provide more public space for religious differences. Freedom to choose and to express different faith is guaranteed. Yeah? Intra and extra relationship and respective manner. Right to change religions without being charged of public offense is also very challenging right now. And we still also have an issue in Indonesia about interreligious marriage, because it is still outlawed and still illegal in Indonesia, and we are trying to convince that this right has to be given by those who choose to have interreligious marriage. And civil autonomy provides wide space for settling religious tension and conflict through non-litigative approach, as I mentioned earlier. State policy ensures any offense and violence directed to religious freedom is properly suppressed. So I would like to add what Professor Badrin has mentioned earlier, that measures, law enforcement measures has to be present in the public arena when there are harmful acts to targeting religious minorities, and also those who perceive different understandings of religion. And in this way that states are encouraged to, this is actually also the challenging issue faced by the civil society in Indonesia, and particularly the National Human Rights Commissions, on how to encourage I think it's not the states, but the parliaments, the parliaments to revoke blasphemy law, because it reflecting the state authoritarian which cause harm and curb the rights of religious minority, as it is stipulated in Article 156A of the Indonesian Penal Code. So our independent Commission of Human Rights is always in consultation and consolidations with the parliaments on how to revoke and also to repel this blasphemy law, and we have to change to more positive approach and to a positive measure in terms of the issue of religious tension. Next, please. Now, the challenge in the public space is how defending freedom of expression while protecting freedom of expression. Yeah. So I think it needs a positive approach with encourage civil engagement. Yeah, civil engagement, as I said, mentioned earlier, to encourage the parliaments to revoke the existing blasphemy law. And this is actually my long advocacy as the chairperson of the OIC Human Rights Commission, also as the commissioner, is to encourage the OIC member states to adopt the OIC sponsored Resolution 1618, which provide adequate civil approach on combating intolerance, negative stereotyping, stigmatization of, and discrimination, incitement of violence against persons based on religion and belief, to be adopted for a positive intervention. And it also combines with the Rabat plans of action, commit the states to addressing religious intolerance through promoting the interrelated and mutually reinforcing rights to freedom of expression, freedom of religion or belief, and also non-discrimination. Yeah. And also this is very crucial to note that any incitement to violence and violent targeting a person or groups of people based on religion and belief should be seriously punished. Yeah. But on the other hand, different expressions and manifestations of religious traditions such as Shi'a, Ahmadi, and other small and minority group should not be denigrated as religious defamation or public offense. Yeah. Next, please. And I think, this is actually the last of my presentation, and I would like to conclude this presentation by highlighting that aside from the prospects of how Islam and human rights is actually being compatible, but again, there is still loopholes, left the tensions prevailed and exist in our public arena, in our public space that need to be overcome and need to be handled in much more positive intervention and a more positive approach. So I will give back the time to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Give applause. Okay, I just want to give to the floor to have a question or so response because we have so much. We don't have so much time. Unfortunately, this is a really interesting session. And okay, please mention your name.
Yeah,
just briefly because we will have another.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Hafiz from HRWG, Human Rights Working Group. Yeah, my organization also working a lot experiences with Mbak Ruhaini in supporting the IPHRC or OIC, Independent Permanent of Human Rights. I have several questions for Mbak Ruhaini and also Prof. Masud Badrin. The first question is related with the maslahah for Prof. Masud and also Mbak Ruhaini. In terms of maslahah, we know that we have experience how we can explain human rights in Aceh, for instance. But before we are attend Aceh and discuss about human rights, they said that human rights is not from the Islamic values, and we cannot accept human rights as our norm, our values. In that situation, actually, the perspective about the maslahah and in my experience, we will have to a choice that really hard how we can manage and deal with that issue in terms of the limit of maslahah and using a nas or text, Islamic text, as our argument. So for instance, we use maslahah to argument about the polygamy or about the inter-religious marriage. What kind of argumentation that we can show to the Islamic leader and convince them about the argumentation of maslahah. In the other hand, we know that Al-Quran and Nas from Hadith, for instance, it's really clear said about the we can say it, discriminatory quote unquote perspective on that issue. That's the question. From our experience, I think that we should not the authoritative source of the argument. I need the explanation from the Prof. Masud Badrin and also Prof. Situr Haini about that. And the second one, the authoritative method, how we can raise with the argument and convince the Islamic organization or Islamic leader. The last question, perhaps for Prof. Ruhaini, about your experience, Mbak, in the ICIHRC, in the commission, how you can deal with the Islamic representative countries, about the critical issues about gender, polygamy, inter-religious marriage, apostasy and blasphemy. What do you think about their own perspective? Is it because the fanaticism or about the lack of knowledge about the Islamic teaching, or that's also about the lack of discussion among them to really serious to learn about the Islamic values? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brother Hafiz. The last question, please, Pak. Just briefly, please, because we don't have no much time.
Thank you. It's an honor to have outstanding speakers. I'd like to ask first Professor Masud. One is that do you have a framework for inclusive public policy that can be implemented for nation state in or majority Muslim countries? It relates to my experience when I asked my teacher about the public policy relates to Islamic perspective. My teacher told me that we need to have our own epistemology on that power knowledge of East-West differences. So could you give us an explanation whether there is a framework for an inclusive public policy related to majority Muslim state, not only based on Western or Eastern perspective? And I'd like also ask Bapak Prof. Nur Hadi Hassan about the Maqasid Sharia, whether it can be one of the answers of the solution for our problems here in Indonesia. Because, for example, when we deal with minorities or different sects, for example, Ahmadiyya, people tend to follow the decision or fatwa from ulamas, while the government needs to have the adjust policy to deal with it. So it's kind of difficult in the implementation from a political perspective, dealing with this issue of minority in Indonesia. And I also attended one of the meeting in one of the ministry, and they don't have the same concept how to deal with this issue. So it's, I mean, it's ridiculous because in the central office, and they don't have the same perspective on dealing with minority. So how about the, for example, the Pemda, how do you call it, deal with them? because in the central office doesn't have that kind of answer. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Please, Professor Masud, you can first respond to those questions, and then second, Professor Nur Haidi, and then the last will be Professor Siti. Is also maybe conclusion, if you have any conclusion that you want to deliver to this audience, because we have still around 15 minutes. Please, Professor Masud.
Thank you very much for those questions. I mean, interesting questions. Yeah, the scope. I'll take the first question on maslaha. The scope of maslaha is always in debate. And if you look in, I mean, usul fiqh, you know, there are different levels of maslaha. I mean, for example, I mean, a lot of the time, the easiness of using maslaha depends on the school of thought in a particular country. For example, in Maliki jurisdictions, you know, maslaha mursala, you know, is usually very useful because the scope of maslaha mursala is quite broad, you know, that is unrestricted maslaha. And a lot of the time, you know, the way to use it is this. I mean, nobody is saying that maslaha should be used, I mean, out of context or against a text, specific text. But the truth is that even nas has to be interpreted in context. You know, nas has to be interpreted in context. A lot of the time, you find out that where, I mean, the problem of, I mean, reconciling maslaha and text comes is that usually maybe the interpretation is just literal interpretation. But if you look at it, in relation to, if you look at most of the text in relation to context, one will be able to, I mean, appreciate that, I mean, sometimes it's not really difficult to reconcile with maslaha. And it's not also, one should not also take it, when we relate maslaha to human rights, take it broadly. My own approach to it is that it's on a right to right approach. I mean, you apply maslaha to a particular issue and look at the issue in context. You talk about the issue of polygamy, for example. Now, I mean, polygamy, if you look at the text, is just ibaha. It is not wajib. It's an ibaha. It's a permissibility. And if you look in all, I mean, usul literature, I mean, in institutions of ibaha, I mean, there's nothing wrong if, for example, a concept, I mean, an ibaha, a permissibility, if it leads to facade or it creates harm, there's nothing wrong for the state, I mean, to step in relation to protect the maslaha of the people. So my point is reconciliation between maslaha and nas is usually, I mean, possible if we look at the context of the text. Now, the second question regarding framework for inclusive public policy in Islam, I did mention it. You know, I mean, the two verses I cited for us, the one in Surah Shura, you know, وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ. I mean, it is through the process of consultation that you bring inclusiveness into the picture. You know, and the Quran specifically says, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. This is the list, I mean, consult them in affairs. So, I mean, inclusivity comes into, I mean, the issue of consultation. Now, I mean, if you look at, from the perspective of development, for example, a lot of the time, a state may, in its own perspective, say that, well, looking at a particular locality, what they want to provide for them to create development, maybe it's a big hotel without consulting the people. Maybe if they consulted the people will say, what we think will be better for us to have a school. I mean, so this is what we are saying. I mean, inclusivity is nurtured by consultation. And the framework is the concept of shura in Islam. It's not being borrowed from, I mean, anywhere. It's there in the text, it's there in the nas, you know, and that's the justificatory principle. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you,
Yes.
Professor. Next is Professor Nur Haidi, please, Professor.
Yes, I think we need more time indeed to build better understandings of people towards human rights. We can start by debunking the distinction between Islam and human rights. I think to some extent we still, you know, like very much to think in a dichotomous way. This is human right, this is Islam. Islam is different from human right. And if we can understand that Islam is actually human right itself, I mean, the very basic of Islam is contained in human right, or vice versa, I think we can slowly and gradually establish the better understanding of the people about the human right. And we should not work only at the elitist level, yes, to make a campaign about human right, but we should go down to talk to the people at the grassroots through small scale programs, for instance, that involve people, local ulama, yes, kiai, and so on, to think about human rights. That's very important. And I can claim actually, we have been quite successful in disseminating human rights at the Kakwa people. Before, at the time also, when we first introduced this program, there was a kind of, hostility against the human right, like what we got from the people. But gradually we try to convince them, and also they inform in reading material and so on. Finally, at least the Kakwa people in Yogyakarta, for instance, and several region in Central Java could understand well the human right and its relation to Islam. I think we need more time indeed. And then the second one about the Makashidu Sharia, minority religious groups, I think our constitution and also our nation state provide already strong framework to deal with the minority groups. The Indonesian Constitution, Article 29, quite clear, guarantee all religious groups to practice their religion. It is quite clear, yeah? And also we know other regulation guarantee the right of the people from the different religious groups to practice their religion. But of course, there are sometimes political pressures put on the shoulder of policymakers, security apparatus, one said. When they are dealing with the issue of Ahmadiyya and the issue of Shia, people will talk about the blasphemy thing related to the groups. And yeah, I think more because of the political pressures, and we cannot stand against such a pressures. So we follow the majority, what is that, the public opinions that try to push us get out from the national and legal framework to deal with such religious groups. So I think all state apparatus, stakeholders, just stand firmly behind the human rights to protect the rights of the minorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will start from your question. The second question is about. I think the point that I wanted to make here is how to deal with the different perspective in handling the minority between the central government with the regional governments. And yes, we realize that there is a gap. The problem that we face in Indonesia now is actually what I call residual mentality of the ethno-religious commonality in the past. I mean, we, in the process, I would say in a positive way that we, in the process of making our public space is much more inclusive. But again, not all groups, not all person, they are allow this public space is accessible to all people. I mean, it's like the majority would say that our norm has to be more reflected in our public space, including also our understandings of what is called the right. The right Islam, the true Islam. So that is actually an anthropological concept, the so-called the mentality, the residual mentality of exclusive sentiment from the past. Now, it has also been the debate and the deliberations from the office of the staff of the president, where I'm now engaging, that we more and more encouraging the law enforcement personnel to take impartial stand to the religious conflict that happen in our society. Let's the civil society represented by social organization to take or to tackle the issue of the substance. I mean, it's like the differences between Shia and Ahmadi against the majority. So let's put this in more civil autonomy to solve in non-litigative, non-judicial process through mediation, through negotiation. But we cannot also be permissive to to violence and to incitement of hatred targeting certain groups. So the law enforcement personnel has to be firm, as also mentioned earlier by Professor Nur Haidi, that the state through the law enforcement personnel has to be firm in taking measures to all harmful harmful acts like the violation, incitement to hatred, and so forth, so that law is there. So the state is present in protecting the people, protecting those who being the target. But the substance of the substance of the conflict has to be left to the civil society to overcome. But the things that we have to also to encourage the civil society as the silent majority is please make a statement and support to our law enforcement personnel, because usually when it's like measures will be taken by them, and they fear of being defending the wrong people. So that is actually all the hesitance of our law personnel when they are dealing with such kind of phase. So if something happens with the minority, for example, with our sisters and our brothers in Sintang, for example, in the case of Ahmadi, please stand. Civil society has to stand and loudly voice the support for the law enforcement to take necessary measures to the violent acts, so that our law personnel will be more confident that they're doing the right things. So that is it's actually the things that we have to all together, the governments and the civil society, the intellectual, don't let silent majority do not do anything to protect the rights of the minority. But still, human rights is not vacuum from political interest as well. So, related to Mas Hafid's questions about, for example, what is the response of the state on blasphemy law? Yeah. So the government is also having various. People in the government is also having various understanding of that. But mostly, this current government is trying to use this article on blasphemy law in the very minimum level, and it will focus mainly on what is actually included in Resolution 1618. So I'm now in charge also in human rights issue in the office of the president. So this is being mainstreams, that we probably is not politically being able to repel and also to invoke the Article 156A on blasphemy law. But I think we shift the understanding, we shift the approach to much more positive into what is explained and what is contained by Resolution 1618, focusing on combating the stereotyping, combating the incitement to violence, the violence, rather than targeting different understanding of religions, a different understanding of the minority like Shia, Ahmadi, and other small groups. So that is actually the what is going on, and what we are trying to mainstream in the governments from the in the central to the regional. But again, it takes time and it takes effort, and us as civil society have also to work very seriously in defending public space is a civic autonomy. While the governments, we have to tell the government to take minimum interventions on that. Yeah, so take the minimum measures only necessary to defend freedom of religion. Mas Hafid, your questions to the OIC members, of course, OIC consists of 57 countries with the different expressions and a different understanding of Islam and different political types. So that is, I cannot really give very simple conclusion on the OIC, but I think right up till now the challenge, the big challenge of the OIC is actually most of the states are state centered. Yeah, it's more state centered policy than giving more autonomy to civil society. So this is my general observation from my visit to some countries in the OIC member states, and this is something to do, I think, with the nation-state building, the process of nation-state building. Some things like Indonesia, maybe Turkey, and maybe Nigeria, and other countries, they have a strong civil society organization and civil society autonomy. So then it is quite easy actually to perceive. I mean, like to put human rights in much more civil manner, yeah, rather than it is controlled by the governments. So so that all the issues that you mentioned earlier, when it's put to the civil autonomy, it's become easier actually to deal with. And what happened in Aceh, of course, this is political. So Professor Badrin and Professor Nur Haidi also mentioning that it's it related to state. When it's related to state, it's related to the political process that we have. It is why then, aside from the principles that we believe that Islam is compatible with international human rights, but the political process in the Muslim world is not a kind of a good matching with such kind of principle. It needs more and more efforts actually to ensure and to convince them that the principles highlighted by Professor Nur Haidi and Professor Badrin has to be implemented, but political situation, especially public space, should also continuously being maintains as a civil autonomy. So it is actually my general observation, and of course your detailed question like polygamy need more time, I think, to discuss. But I'm agree with Professor Badrin's that in our school of thought, anything related to Sharia is actually human thought. And I convinced the commissioners of this, the OIC commissioner, that when it's come to Cairo Declaration, for example, when we understand Sharia is actually in that case, as also mentioned by Professor Nurhaidi and also Professor Badrin, that it involves human thought, and human thought has a spectrum. We have a spectrum of liberal, progressive, moderate, conservatives. So the things that we have to do either in Indonesia or in other OECD member states is how to venture the understanding of Islam into moderate understandings of human rights. And also we also urge other countries, especially in the West, where secularization is able actually to translate, the human rights in such a way, but I think it will then create a clash of civilization. The clash of fundamentalism. If, for example, a secular fundamentalism is used by non-OIC member state, and the OIC member state, they also use Islamic fundamentalism. So there is no such a compatible way. But if both of secular states and Islamic state, they can venture to the middle, to moderate understanding of human rights, then this is actually the way, this is the boundary that we can build together in understanding human rights as the universal principle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Give applause to those panelists. I'm really apologize to those panelists due to the time constraint that we have to finish this panel. Actually, it's really interesting that for the 2 hours we have already run and also listened from the panelists. And please also, if you have any question and also any further discussion, please just contact Professor Badrin and also Professor Nurhaidi and also Professor Ruhaini. I think those are really credible sources for learn and also to how we can continue to overcome the challenge, the implementation of human rights and Islam in the public policy, because public policy is something that really reflecting how Islam and also human rights working in the community, and those community, especially as those who are minority and also vulnerable. Thank you very much, Professor Mas Badrin, long way from London. Our warmest regard from we are here from Indonesia. Hope sometime we can meet directly. And also Professor Nurhaidi, thank you very much, Professor.
Sama-sama, terima kasih banyak.
Of course, also Professor Ruhaini, thank you very much. We have to close this session. Thank you very much. Please, after this, we have a declaration will be read by Komnas HAM and also by the Minister of Religious Affairs. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, assalamualaikum.
Terima kasih. Waalaikumsalam.
Terima kasih. Okay, bye.